Hit record here. So, yeah, it's just you two for now. So we'll see if anybody else logs in, but we'll get started. So I thought today, oh, let me look at the timeline. Um, I like looking at the timeline just to see how things fit into history. So I highlighted it yellow. Today we're going to look at the civil rights movement. Okay, so this is roughly the 1950s and 60s. Now, think back. This is civil rights refers to generally, well, I mean, rights of everybody is the goal, but specifically the civil rights in the 1950s and 60s focused on African Americans in the United States. Of course, their history goes back to the colonial period in 1619, so we just passed the 400-year anniversary of the first slave ship coming from Africa. 1619, very early on in American history. Not quite right away, but very basically right away, within a decade of the first English settlers coming over to what would then become the British colonies, they brought with them African slaves. And so that history continues up. I don't think we've really talked about it much, but it goes to the Civil War. We fight the Civil War in the 1860s here on the timeline. 1860s, we fight the Civil War, the North wins, and then we pass, and we've discussed recently, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which end slavery, 13th Amendment ends slavery very quickly after the Civil War. 14th Amendment gives all African American men, still just men, but African American men citizenship, or no, I guess everybody's a citizen. All African American citizens, or anybody, anybody, citizenship of any race. And then the 15th Amendment, 13, 14, 15th Amendment gives anybody, regardless of race, men still, the right to vote. Any citizen male, the right to vote. So that's the 1860s, late 1860s. Then you have the Reconstruction, and we can look at the Reconstruction sometime. That's a period, maybe a decade or two after the Civil War, when they're trying to piece the country back together. And actually, African Americans took huge step forwards in their running of their state governments, local governments. There was even United States senators, and this is just after the Civil War, just after the slaves were freed. There's black people who are elected senators, United States senators in the South. Well, the Reconstruction goes great for a decade and a half, and then just comes screeching to a halt, and racism pushes back, and a lot of those positive steps forward were shoved backwards. So then you have not great race relations and situations for American blacks through the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. Gets to the 1950s, and we have the civil rights movement. Okay, there's a ton of things that happen in the civil rights movement. What comes to your minds? What pictures or events come to your minds for the civil rights movement?
Probably Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King Jr., famous black pastor. Where is he from? I think Alabama. No. I think where was he? Where did he live? Mississippi, maybe. I don't know. But from down in the South, became a leader. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, gives the I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., led a lot of marches, a lot of protests. He was a big leader. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. What else about the civil rights movement? What comes to mind?
I do not know a lot of about this.
Tolulope, what do you think of with the civil rights movement?
I think Martin Luther
Maybe
King, like Miss Nadia said, and
maybe women's
uh,
some
think of like
movement for women's rights.
Well, women's rights, women got the right to vote in the 1920s with, what was that, the 19th Amendment. Actually, we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of that this year. Um, so women's rights kind of separate. Of course, civil rights, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, they wanted the rights to apply to everybody. But of course, the driving force was African Americans. So I'm sorry, Tolu Lupe, what comes to your mind?
I was thinking the Greensboro sit-ins because we were just celebrating that anniversary in February.
Yeah. Okay, the sit-ins. Yeah, we could talk about them sometime. So they were pro. So what was the purpose of those sit-ins? What did they accomplish? What was the purpose?
The sit-ins were um, started in Greensboro, North Carolina, um, at a what was it? Like a drugstore um, counter where they would not serve African Americans with whites.
Hmm.
So they sat there until they would be served, and it continued for quite a while, spread to other cities and states in the South, and sooner or later they gave in and they said they would treat everyone equally.
Right, right. So what do we call that when like they refused to serve black people, or there was white water fountains and black water fountains, and you know and the bus, you have Rosa Parks on the buses. What do you call that when they're separate like
Like
that?
separation. Yeah. It was discrimination.
Well, discrimination, right? They're being discriminated against.
Separation.
Well, there's a word that's actually a lot like separation. I'm thinking of the word
Segregation.
segregation. Okay, so segregation was either the cultural pattern or written into these laws, and especially in the South, written into laws like there's separate schools for blacks and whites, separate theaters for blacks and whites. You had to behave a certain way on the bus. Rosa Parks got into trouble because she sat at the front of the bus, whereas black people were supposed to sit at the back of the bus. So, of course, today all the cool kids sit at the back of the bus, so it's like totally opposite. But so you have that segregation. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. One thing and I have on the screen here, I just Googled Greensboro sit-ins 1960. So yeah, as you were saying, as a manner of protest, they sat down and demanded to be served, um, and didn't get up until they were. Now they weren't, and you have. Uh, so I'm not seeing the. Oh, here's the picture that I like that I think of. So, and it wasn't just black people. It was a lot of students. It was a lot of college age people who had a lot of passion for this, and a lot of white people, white students would join in the protests and sit beside the black people. And this was organized. They planned it out. Um, and it wasn't for the faint-hearted. You couldn't just, you had to be a pretty brave person to sit there, because here's the picture that I always think of. These people, they're dumping soda, they're dumping ketchup like on their heads, and these people, they're just sitting there, right? Um, Peaceful protest and that's what Martin Luther King Jr. always talked about. Peaceful protest. They're not fighting back. They're not saying nasty things. They're having nasty things, terribly nasty things said at them. They're having things dumped on their heads, but they're just sitting there trying to get, what they're saying is they're trying to get served lunch at a lunch counter just like anybody else. So there's lots of different ways throughout the 1950s and 60s that blacks and whites and anybody friendly to civil rights were trying to get changes made in society, um, either in our daily life, like do you have to move to the back of the bus? Are you allowed to be served at a lunch counter? Are you going to get served at a lunch counter? And of course, getting laws changed. The big civil rights bill passes in 1964, but of course, you can pass a law, but that doesn't mean people's behavior is going to change. So it's still, and of course, today we still have, there's still all kinds of inequality and all kinds of problems. Um, Progress, I hope, but still problems. So today what we're going to look at is segregation in schools. And the famous instance is what we're going to look at is the integration of Central High School. This is Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The group of students we're going to discuss is called, in history we always call them the Little Rock Nine. It's 9 students who go into their apply, register for high school, and start attending high school. Now you see here in this photograph, it's a bunch of African American students, a bunch of white students staring at them, and they're being escorted by a military person into their high school. So, we're here today, living through the coronavirus event, and I think it's going to last weeks or months here, at least be a part of our lives for a while. And this is a historical event. But I think the study of history is good because it can give us a perspective. We may think our lives are tumultuous and crazy and have been totally thrown up in the air and chaotic, and that may be. The last couple of weeks have been pretty crazy. But I think the value of history is looking back and saying, okay, people just like me have lived through some pretty crazy times. And I think when you look at the 1950s and 60s, especially if you lived down south, it's a pretty crazy time in history. The civil rights movement, big things were happening all the time, and everyday people had to step up and make some tough decisions. Are you going to go along with, the norm of not serving that person at the lunch counter, or dumping, going in and mocking them and dumping stuff on their head? Or are you going to step out, take a risk for yourself, and try to change society the hard way? So let's dive in. So we've got, the title is Integration of Central High School. I should call it probably the Little Rock Nine, because that's what we're really talking about. Let's look at subtitles or headings here. So this first paragraph is kind of an overall introduction. And then we have history of social integration in the U.S., kind of overall. We're going to look at some Supreme Court rulings today, so that's good. Little Rock Nine, recruited, students turned away by state troops, and I think one more. And aftermath. So we'll look at kind of what happens after. So let's just dive in. I don't have any, I was going to write some questions that we could discuss at the end, but let's just talk our way through it, read our way through it, and see what we think. I've highlighted some good social studies phrases and American vocabulary words, so we can just kind of learn as we go. Let me read the first paragraph, which I think is just a general introduction to the whole thing. Kind of actually a summary of the whole article, and then it starts getting more specific. So it says, in a key event of the American Civil Rights Movement, 9 black students enrolled at the formerly all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957. Testing a landmark 1954 U.S. Supreme Court ruling. The court had mandated, this would be in 1954, the court had mandated as part of its groundbreaking Brown versus the Board of Education that all public schools in the country be integrated. However, on September 4th, 1957, the first day of classes at Central High, Governor Orville Faubus, That's a good name. Orville Faubus called in the state National Guard to keep the black students out of the school. Later in the month, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent in federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. They started their first full day of classes on September 25th. So that is kind of like a preview of the story. So we know what American civil rights movement is. We've talked about that. There's a lot of people and famous events that I'm sure you've looked at or seen or heard about before. Lots of things went into the civil rights movement. When they say a landmark 1954 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court has a term. They kind of go by year by year, and they hear about 100 courses or 100 court cases a year, and they issue rulings, which is their final decision. If they're describing Brown v. the Board of Education, which I should have probably italicized because it's a title of almost like a book. It's a title of their decision. They describe it as a landmark case. What do they mean, a landmark case?
Because it reversed the previous laws.
Yeah, right. This is I think the first what it would be referring to, I think was, I don't know when it was, in the 1830s or 40s, before the Civil War. You have Plessy versus Ferguson, or maybe it was, I don't know when that was. Plessy versus Ferguson, which the Supreme Court established the idea of separate but equal. Okay, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case, they decided that separate but equal. You could have, it must have been after the, well, let's Google it real fast.
I think it was after.
Yeah, it must have.
Because I just had to study that for my HiSIT test. Quite interesting.
1896. So yeah, it was after the Supreme Court, or after the Civil War. So Plessy versus Ferguson, this is a Supreme Court case, 1896, establishes the idea of separate but equal. You can have separate schools for blacks and whites and separate theaters for blacks and whites, especially, here we care about school, but they have to be equal. Well, guess what? Half a century later, they were separate, but they were not equal. In every town in America where there was a white school and a black school, the white school was better, had more qualified teachers who probably got paid more, they got more tax money. So separate but equal was not working. So somebody brought this case to the Supreme Court, Brown v. Board of Education. It's actually Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So it's a specific, somebody was suing their school board in the town of Topeka, Kansas. And so they say that all public schools in the country have to be integrated. Now you have segregated, which is an awful lot like separated, which is what it is. Integrated means they have to be brought together. Okay, so you can know after 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, they say you cannot have separate but equal. There's no separate but equal. You can't have a black school and a white school in your town. You have to have everybody eligible to go to the school. But it takes some time to make that happen. So you have, here we are 3 years later, and it still hasn't really even happened anywhere yet. Okay, so and mandated, of course, means they said that it has to happen. It's mandatory. Okay. Nadia, could you read paragraph 2? Now we'll go into it. Going back a little bit, we'll look at the overall history.
And it's Brown versus Board of Education decision issued May 17, 1954. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. Until then, many states had segregation laws, requiring African American and Caucasian, how can I say this?
Caucasian. That's a
Caucasian children
yeah.
to attend separate schools. Resistance to the ruling was so widespread that the court issued a second decision in 1955 known as Brown 2, ordering school districts to integrate with all deliberate speed.
Okay, so the Supreme Court says in 1954 you can't segregate schools anymore, and the country just sat there and did nothing. So they issue a second decision in 1955 that says, you know, because we've passed this, because we've issued this ruling a year ago and nobody's done anything across the whole country, schools have to integrate with all deliberate speed. Okay, that's 1955. Now the Little Rock Nine happens in 1957, so still 2 more years go by. Okay, uh, Tolulope, could you read paragraph 3?
Yes. In response to the Brown decisions and pressure from the local chapter of the National Board for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the Little Rock School Board adopted a plan for gradual integration of its schools. The first institutions to integrate would be the high schools, beginning in September 1957. Two groups formed to organize the plan: the Capital Citizens Council and the Mothers League of Central High School.
Okay, so yeah, so they make a plan, school board makes a plan. Okay, that's fine. Do it slowly. Okay, whatever. And then two groups form to oppose the plan. So two groups in town say, no, we don't like this idea and we're not going to let it happen. The thing with the civil rights movement is it was very organized, even on a national level. This wouldn't have just been people in the town of Little Rock, Arkansas. There would have been people across the country who were advising them and choosing this to be the right place to do this. Rosa Parks, who gets arrested for not moving on a bus. I think that's I think it's 1954, somewhere in there. I don't think she was the first person ever to get arrested for not moving on a bus,
No,
but
she wasn't.
she was kind of chosen to kind of become the face of that problem. I forget, I don't know too much about her history, but she wasn't the first person to do it, but she was the first person that they really NCAA or not NCAA, that's college sports, and NAACP kind of chose her as a person to go forward and run into this problem, be arrested, and become the face of this problem. And then, of course, they capitalize on that. And then there's, in that town, Montgomery, Alabama, there's the bus boycott, and they make a big deal out of it because it was strategic. This wasn't just the whole country, people just acting on their own. It was very, very organized. So the whole country now is looking at Little Rock, or about to look at Little Rock, Arkansas. So paragraph 4, Little Rock 9 recruited. Despite the opposition, 9 students registered to be the first Americans to attend Central High School. Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Terrence Robert, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlota Walls had been recruited by Daisy Gaston Bates, president of the Arkansas NAACP. So they were recruited. They were chosen, interviewed and handpicked to be the people. These are high school teenagers, to be the people to go in, the first kids to go into this previously all white high school. Bates and others carefully examined the students and determined that they had the strength to face the resistance they would encounter. In the weeks before the start of school, they participated in counseling sessions on what to expect when classes began and how to respond to hostile situations. It takes training to be able to sit there like those kids at the lunch counter, or to go into a high school and have people hitting you and throwing things at you and yelling things at you, and you to keep yourself under control. That takes training, and they gave these young people training on how to do that. And of course, I'm sure their parents had to obviously fully agree to everything because they were in danger. Okay, Nadia, paragraph 5. Could you read that for us? And it's Governor Faubus.
On September 2nd, 1957, Governor Faubus announced that he would call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the African American students' entry to Central High, claiming this action was for the students' own protection. In a televised address, Faubus said that violence and bloodshed might break out if Black students were allowed in. Federal Judge Richard Davis issued a ruling that desegregation would continue as planned.
Okay, there's another good word, desegregation, which is the act that they're doing. They're kind of unsegregating the schools, desegregating. Yeah, the governor of the state, the governor comes in and says he's going to use the Arkansas National Guard to stop these teenagers from entering the school. Gets on television trying to get support for himself. And he says that violence and bloodshed might break out if Black students were allowed in. So he says that it's for their own safety and the safety of the community that I'm not going to let them into the high school. Which, that very well may be true, but I mean, what do you do? Do you not enforce the laws, and do you continue to discriminate against people just because violence might happen? No, I mean, I think he should have stepped up and said, we will defend them and prevent violence. But instead, he just kind of almost encouraged violence. Okay. Tolu Lope, could you read paragraph 6, and I'll scroll down when I need to for you.
Okay. Students turned away by state troops. The Little Rock Nine arrived for the first day of school on September 4th. 8 arrived together, driven by Baines. Eckford's family, however, did not have a telephone, and Baines could not reach her to let her know of the carpool plans, so Eckford arrived alone. One of the most enduring images from the day is a photo of Eckford, notebook in hand, approaching the school as a crowd of hostile, screaming white students and adults surround her. Eckford later recalled that one of the women spat on her. The Woman of Eckford was printed and broadcast widely, gaining national and international attention.
Okay, and here to the right we have that famous picture. Yeah, 8 students carpooled. This girl, think back, this is the 1950s. They didn't have a telephone. So she didn't get the news that they were going to meet somewhere and carpool. So she arrives dangerously alone and just walks to school, or walks some degree. So you have this very ugly picture, and interestingly snapped just at the moment there. You can look at these dirty looks she's getting. This lady behind her is screaming, but she's well trained. She's just eyes straight ahead and not going to cause trouble on her own. So you have the town and the Arkansas National Guard blocking them from entering school. These are just high schoolers. They're juniors and seniors. I don't know how old they were, but just kids. Paragraph 7, the Arkansas National Guard kept the Little Rock Nine from entering the school. Davies began legal proceedings against Faubus, the governor, and Eisenhower, the president, tried to persuade Faubus to remove the National Guard and let the students in. So this is a national thing. The president of the United States is acting on their behalf to try to get the governor to step aside. Davies orders the guard removed, and the Little Rock Police Department took over to maintain order. The police escorted the 9 African American students into the school on September 23rd through an angry mob of some 1,000 white protesters. As riots began, the police removed the 9 students. The next day, Eisenhower sent 1,200 members of the U.S. Army and placed them in charge of the 10,000 National Guardsmen on duty. Escorted by the troops, this is like the United States Army now, the Little Rock Nine attended their first full day of classes on September 25th. So think of your worst day at school, and then imagine these kids are in such. I believe they had like Army bodyguards essentially with them in school. I think for that whole school year, if I remember correctly, or maybe they were like posted outside their classroom doors, but they had bodyguards with them the whole school year, if I remember correctly. That's incredible bravery for them and their parents, their family. Just crazy to think about. So I thought of this painting, this famous painting, and I looked it up, and it's Norman Rockwell. And it's his painting, the title is The Problem We All Live With, which is interesting. And it's 1964. But then I was wrong. I thought that was about this, but of course, this is just 1957. This is just the beginning of desegregation. So there's a lot of other, presumably every school in the country, or the South anyway, needed to be desegregated. So there's a lot more stories like this out there. But I looked it up, and it says it depicts Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African-American girl on her way to William Franz Elementary School, an all-white public school, on November 14th, 1960, during the New Orleans school desegregation crisis. So I thought when I chose this topic and I was putting the pictures in, I thought of this famous painting, but it's actually a painting of something else. But I thought it's a pretty famous painting, so I wanted to toss it in there, but it's related. Nadia, could you read, where are we here? Yeah, read paragraph 8 and 9.
Mhm. Legal challenges to integration continued, and Faber said several times that he wanted the Little Rock Nine removed from Central High, although several of the black students had positive experiences of their first day of school. They experienced harassment and even violence the rest of the year. Pacho or Patilo was
Yeah.
kicked and beaten and had aces thrown in her face, and Ray was pushed down a flight of stairs. The Army and National Guard troops remained in Central High for the rest of the year.
Okay. Can you read 9 too?
Yeah. On May 25th, 1958, Green, the only senior among the 9, became the first African American graduate of Central High.
Okay. So yeah, it says that several of them had positive experiences. I suppose they're, during their first school day, some kids were nice to them. So it'd be interesting to learn more about that. But then, yeah, the Army and National Guard was in the school for the rest of the year. Okay, aftermath. In September 1958, this is the next year, Faubus closed Little Rock's high schools for the entire year, pending a public vote to prevent African American attendance. So instead of allowing African American kids to get a good education, he said he just closed the schools. Like that's how stubborn that governor was. Little Rock residents voted 19,000 to 7,000 against integration, and the schools remained closed. Tells you something about Little Rock, Arkansas at the time. The rest of the Little Rock Nine completed their high school careers by correspondence or at other high schools across the country. Eckford joined the Army and later earned her General Educational Development (GED) diploma. Little Rock's high schools reopened in August 1959, so they were closed for 1 year. Totally Lope, could you finish this out with paragraph 11?
Yes. Several of the Little Rock Nine went on to distinguished careers. Green served as Assistant Secretary of the Federal Department of Labor under President Jimmy Carter. Brown worked as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Workforce Diversity in the Department of the Interior under President Bill Clinton. Patillo worked as a reporter for NBC. The group has been widely recognized for its significant role in civil rights history. In 1999, Clinton awarded each of them with the Congressional Gold Medal. The nine also received invitations to President Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that's the Little Rock Nine. Again, kind of the most famous, and if not the first, and certainly one of the very first cases of integration of public schools. Previously all white, needed to be integrated because of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling. Took a few years to happen. 1957, you have the Little Rock Nine. And we see, for everybody pushing in the direction of progress and civil rights, you have somebody pushing against them. In this story, you could say the bad guy in this story is the governor, Orville Faubus, who not only opposed them entering to begin with, but then grumbled about it the whole time, the whole year they were there, and then the following year, to make sure it didn't happen again, closed the schools. That's some stubbornness right there, and of course racism. Any questions? What do you guys think about this?
No, I don't have any question.
I feel like I saw one time like a news thing, I think somewhere online. They tracked down this lady in this famous picture. Who was the student? Eckford. The lady yelling behind her, like they somehow tracked her down. And she was like totally changed. She knew she was wrong. Like it was she wasn't a lifelong racist or anything like that. But I think I saw that somewhere. And then a few years ago, something happened to the Little Rock Nine. What happened? Let me see. I feel like what happened? Oh, maybe it was just the 60. Yeah, it must have been would that be the 60-year anniversary, 70-year anniversary? Because I did a lesson like this. I know because I was looking for what we could talk about, and I had this article pulled up or saved on my computer, and it was from 2017. So I must have looked it up when we did when it must have been in the news for the 60th anniversary. So yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things out there. So yeah, you have a pretty interesting history, a ton of different layers to the civil rights movement. Who was Malcolm X? Do we know that name in the civil rights movement? Why was he notable?
Malcolm X, he was another famous civil rights leader. However, he was Islamic.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a bit more opposed to the nonviolent protests of Dr. King, but then had a change of heart once he went to Mecca and was later on assassinated by some of his former followers who did not quite agree with his change of heart.
Yeah. Yeah, you always forget that he did have a change of heart. So yeah, Malcolm X, let's Google him. Good to see names here. So Malcolm X was another civil rights leader in the 1950s, 1960s, but he was kind of like an opposing voice to um, Martin Luther King Jr. Whereas Martin Luther King Jr., yeah, like you said, pushed the nonviolence, like absolute nonviolence. Malcolm X said that, hey, there's times when violence is called for. If you're getting shot at and African Americans are being hung and lynched, um, violence could be a tool you use. Um, of course, that made him very unpopular in a lot of circles. Uh, but a real comparison between him and Martin Luther King Jr. But yeah, and then you forget, at least it's easy for me to forget, that Malcolm X, he wasn't like, a terrorist, but he felt that violence could be a tool you use, or defense, to defend yourself. Um, but he did have a change of heart after he became uh, Islamic and became very religious. He had a change of heart, and you're right, yeah. He was assassinated, but you're right. It was because he changed his ways. The people that agreed with him at first were the ones who assassinated him because he changed his outlook, his viewpoint. All these people were pushing in the same direction. They wanted civil rights. They wanted African Americans not to be treated so terribly in American society. They wanted laws passed that would protect people. But everybody had, different people had different opinions on how to get there, how to do that. Uh, some people were taking the lunch counter sit-in strategy, and other people were taking um, we got to get the laws changed strategy. Uh, so very, very complex piece of American history. And of course, is America perfect today? I certainly don't think so. So, a lot of these stories go on. Um, so, okay. Any other questions or comments?
No, thank you.
So Nadia, let me ask you if you don't mind. So in the Ukraine and um, Europe, Eastern Europe,
Mm-hmm.
um, do you have the tension between races, I know you have ethnic groups, right? But they're like, you know, more nationalities. Do you have like
Yeah.
race problems, like between black people and
Um,
white people, or?
Actually, we don't have much black people there, but I recall when I was at school at college, and one of our teacher, we had international students there, and they even were not black. They were like from Vietnam or something. Like they were colored, and this teacher really behaved bad against them.
Oh, really?
But it was not as bad as here. But we had discrimination, but different way against Christian. I remember that because I was at school, and if you were not part of communism, different parties like for young kids, for middle school kids, and I were not part of this, so people did not understand me, and it was really bad. The principal of our school took me away from lessons, and they just tried to like to turn me out of God, of church. They said so many bad things about my parents, that they were not good parents because they taught me about God, about Jesus. So, and my older brothers were beaten at school because they were Christian. So we had situation, not racist, but against Christian.
Yeah. Hmm. So, yeah, see, in America, like I said, from the very close to the very beginning, you've had this racial tension, this racial problem, the racial inequality, for I don't know how many centuries you have the only black skinned people were slaves or former slaves. You have, there's a good amount of former slaves or freedmen especially in the North in the early 1800s and stuff. But um, generally speaking, this this tension, this racial inequality anyway, is always with us. Wherever you look in American history, it's going to be there. If you just look a little bit.
So actually, I recall something bad, like bad pages in Ukrainian stories, and it was not against black people because we did not have black people there.
Uh-huh.
And actually, it's like hidden stories um, from Ukrainian about Ukraine, and they uh, persecute Polish people. In some parts of Ukraine, they fought against Polish people because there were so many Polish people more than Ukrainian people.
Mm.
And when World War II took place there, they killed Polish people just because they spoke Polish language, just because they were Polish. And I've heard about 80,000 Polish people were killed just for maybe 3 years during World War II.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
they were killed by Ukrainian, not by enemy.
Yeah. 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 So you have in Europe where everybody, we would just say generally is white, is European. You don't have many Africans, although today there's more and more African people spreading, moving around the world. Um, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean there's not hate and discrimination. You have, I think, in Europe, like you said, the the Ukrainians and the Poles, and all kinds of nationality hatred and dislike and distrust. Um, yeah, unfortunately, I think that's an ugly part of apparently being a human is hatred for other people. Um, but at the same time, we have there's progress to be made. This is here is a story of progress. It's if you look at the last paragraph, these people went on to be very accomplished. They're serving in the government, assistant secretary in the Department of Labor. Somebody serves under Bill Clinton. 1999, Clinton gives them all a Congressional Gold Medal, which is a big honor. So there is progress to be made. Is it, is American progress perfect and unbroken? No, not at all. But um, there's good and bad to be found in all these stories. Um, so okay, so maybe we'll come back to the civil rights movement at some point. Maybe we could look at like an overview and look at kind of just touch on a lot of the different stories, like Rosa Parks, like the sit-ins, like Malcolm X and um, Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe we could kind of look at a broad history sometime and just touch on that. So, okay. Anything else? Any questions at all?
No, thank you for this lesson.
Good. Okay. Well, I'll send out the recording and the article. You can look it over again. I would encourage you this weekend, just check it out, kind of remind yourself, learn it a little more deeply. But yeah, thanks for logging in. Be safe this week, and I'll talk to you next week.
Yes, you do the same.
All right.
Thank you. Have a great week. Bye.
Yep. Ladies, have a good week.
Thank you.